Thank you, Professor Clive Kessler, with a rather different perspective, a lot more historical, sociological, and you also point out the importance for Muslims in the way to make an Islamic value, not just as an answer to be an Islamic value. Okay, now I would like to open the floor for questions. I would like to take the advantage of being a moderator to voice the first question, mainly to Professor Nader Hashemi. Particularly, you mentioned about one of the challenge when it comes to understanding Islam and understanding liberty as an Islamic value is the situation of modernity itself. My question would be, does the understanding, one point is not just about liberty, but from another way to see it is how do we understand what is Islam and Islamic, as mentioned by Prof. Kessler just now. So do you see there is a differences in how Muslims in general understand what is Islamic if you want to compare the current time of modernity and in previous years and in the previous times moving as far as the time of the Prophet? So that would be my question. And after that, I would like to open the floor for questions, please, for the first question, number one. Anyone else, please raise their hand. I'm going to open for 3 questions first. Number 2. And anyone else? Not yet.
Yes.
Okay.
My question is to Dr. Nader. One of the slides that you mentioned about blasphemy and freedom of expression should be allowed unless it violates completely sacred. So what amounts to what is sacred?
Yeah.
Only who should determine it, because what is sacred to me may not be sacred to me.
Right.
My second question is to
Please introduce yourself first.
Yeah, my name is Muzaffar, right? I've been following Muzaffar in the YouTube. That's what brings me here. Is liberty is an Islamic value. Let's go back to the basic principle why God created mankind. This is something that we all have in common, regardless of races you are or religions. In Surah 51:56, Azariah 56. And I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me. Right? In Arab, the word abdu is a surfboard. Yeah? Surf. It was clearly stated in the Quran that our job title as man is as a servant of God. We should serve God all the time. Right? By obeying His word in all His holy book of Torah, Injil, and Quran. Also, as clearly stated in one of the hadith Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, "Tutikum amri ma tamasakum bihi ma la tazidu abda, tabawahi wa rasulatan rasulihi." Which means, behold these 2 things and you will not walk forever. Those are all books of Allah and all sunnah Rasul of Allah. From the interpretation above, we understood that God created mankind comes with the manual. Even creation by man, even creation by man would come with manual or guidelines. So the formula of life should be the guide plus the practice. As a result, to be a peace and happiness. In the Surah.
Excuse me, can you straightforward with the questions?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
So the question is, are we doing as what God wants us to do, or according to what it says in the guide of Quran? The liberty which has been given in many countries does not really portray a good result of mankind's living quality. There are still a lot of homeless people around. Robbery is everywhere, killings happen almost every day, lies, we all lie all the time. Example, authority here, on the way, something like that. Do you think that is the misconception of living at all?
Thank you. 3 questions being asked, mainly first by Adriana on the question on blasphemy and how does it relate to the Muslim societies at the current time. And she also asked a question to Zainah. There are improvements in other countries, but there's none in Malaysia, at least, more or less. That's the question, right? More or less. And main thing is about, is there a relation to mazhab? That part. Right? Okay. And the third question, if I got it correctly, how to relate back the discussion of liberty as an Islamic value, whether the concept of liberty is mainly based on the definition of a person, or how do you need to relate back to the guidelines of the manuals, mainly from the Quran and the other Islamic sources. I think that is more or less the question. I would like to ask Professor Nader Hashemi to respond to the questions first. Remember my first question as well.
The question that was first asked to me, how does the relationship between Islam and liberty manifest itself in a modern context as opposed to in previous periods, right? That's the question you posed to me? Well, I think one of the big differences and one of the challenges of modernity is it demands greater recognition for individual rights and the individual's ability to interpret what's good for him or her, as opposed to in previous periods where we were living in a more communal or collective mode of living. So I think one of the challenges that bears on the modern context is how do we acknowledge individual liberty, an individual liberty to interpret religion and to not be forced to adhere to a conception of religion that is imposed on us by those people who claim to speak in the name of God. I think that's one of the key differences. And of course the other big difference in a modern context is the theme of equality and the theme that Zainah Anwar spoke about, the critical demand in a modern context to challenge patriarchal interpretations, to elevate the question of gender justice and to include everyone in society. In the previous pre-modern era, it was very much a male-centered patriarchal worldview. And if you were a woman, you were just considered to be, you were just accepted your status as an inferior. So the challenge of modernity is how do you include everyone in the conversation about what it means to be Muslim and to allow everyone to have a say to determine and shape their own future and their own understanding of Islam. I think those are some of the big differences. With respect to the question of blasphemy, how do we agree? I think the question was how do we agree on what is blasphemous? Because what might be blasphemous to me may not be blasphemous to someone else. Well, I think in democratic societies you have to have these, you try to develop some sort of broad overlapping consensus in terms of what the limits of freedom can be and should be. Not everyone will agree on what those limits are. So just to cite one example that is not generally well known or understood or appreciated on this question of blasphemy is Europe is broadly and overwhelmingly the most secular parts of the planet. In many European countries, you do have laws on the books that are effectively the moral equivalent of what I would call secular blasphemy laws, because there's a broad, overwhelming consensus in those societies that there are some topics that are so sensitive and so sacred in a secular context that they cannot be discussed, debated, and criticized. And I'm referring specifically to the existence of many laws on the books in Europe that prohibit the questioning or the rejection of any sort of discussion related to the Nazi Holocaust. The Nazi Holocaust in Germany, you question it publicly, you can be fined, you can be imprisoned. Now, many people don't understand why that's the case. They think it has to do with powerful lobbies. But the reality is that in those societies, there's some topics that are so sacred to the history, the memory of those communities that they've decided that those topics have to be off limits to freedom of discussion. So with respect to, that broad principle, I think these issues are very difficult to agree upon. They fundamentally violate freedom of expression, but as you know, Chandra Muzaffar sort of alluded to, different societies will have different modalities and will arrive at different agreements on what the limits of freedom of expression can be or should be. My own personal point of view is that I'm strongly in favor of a very much of a maximum expansive interpretation of liberty and freedom of discussion, and then you hope that people will then exercise their own sense of responsibility to not deliberately and purposefully offend notions of sacred that someone else will have. So for example, in the case of this issue that emerged about 10 years ago, the Danish cartoon affairs. The Danish cartoon affairs were very, offensive to Muslims. In the case of the United States, no major newspaper published those cartoons because they realized it was just the irresponsible thing to do. They could have done it, they had the right to do it, but editors just exercised their responsibility that in the sake of order, in the sake of respect, we're not going to do what some European newspapers did. So there's always a difficult balance. There's never an agreement. I don't think people should be punished or fined or go to prison for freedom of expression unless you're openly advocating and promoting harm against an identifiable group. In other words, you're using your right to freedom of expression to try and generate hatred and anger and violence against a group. Then I think there's legitimate reasons where you can actually put restrictions. But other than that, you just hope that people will be responsible, that they live in a community, and you should not purposely try to offend the sensibility of other people. And if someone does try to do that, well then you just try and you hope that cooler minds will prevail. I mean, that's my personal point of view. That's how I think about the topic.
Obviously, it's not a question of why Malaysia is regressing or not progressing. I don't think that the issue is the Shafi'i mazhab, because Indonesia also follows the Shafi'i mazhab. The issue is how Islam has been so politicized and institutionalized to serve the interests of those in authority in Malaysia. Indonesia does not have that tradition of that massive institutionalization of religion. They don't suffer that. So as a result, there's a history of independent scholarship that has always emerged in a country like Indonesia that has not emerged in the same way in Malaysia. And it's, for me, like every time I go to Indonesia, it's just such an amazing country. The level of scholarship, the level of debate that takes place in the Islamic universities. I mean, the curriculum in the Islamic universities in Indonesia is a vast difference from the curriculum of the Islamic universities or the Islamic faculties in Malaysia. In Indonesia, gender is integrated in all the different streams of studies. In the Quran, in the study of the Quran, in the study of law, of philosophy, there's gender. There's a gender department in the Islamic University in Yogyakarta, in Jakarta, that trains the teaching staff of all the different Islamic university branches in 17 provinces on the issue of gender and rights. It's amazing to see how they teach the Quran. The verse on polygamy, like I know the professor who's doing this in Yogyakarta, they say, for example, on the whole issue of interpretation, they will divide the class into groups from the first classical period of interpretive tradition to the contemporary period. So the work of Sisters in Islam is part of the letters to the editor that we wrote, the question and answer booklets that we wrote, are all used in the Islamic university. I was so shocked to give a public talk, and students had photocopies of the first Sisters in Islam letter on the issue of polygamy in 1990 in their hands. This was part of their study. But this is not so in Malaysia. And why is that so in Indonesia? Because again, there's a political will to reform the teaching of Islam, to make sure that the Muslims of Indonesia live in the modern world and deal with the challenge of modernity. Of course, they face their own threats. And in fact, today, you see the rising politicization of Islam, and what's happened to the governor of Jakarta recently is very, very troubling for many people in Indonesia. The sad thing, I think, for Malaysia is that in the 1980s, we were seen as a progressive Muslim country. Our laws, certainly the Islamic family law of Malaysia, was seen as one of the most progressive, if not the most progressive Islamic family law in the Muslim world. Not today. Rounds of amendments, 2 rounds of amendments were made to chisel away at rights that were granted in the 1980s. These rights are being taken away, and increased discrimination in the name of the real. Suddenly they've discovered what is authentic Islam. Authentic Islam is to discriminate against women. So further discriminations were made against women. And the sad thing is, if you look at the old statute books of the Islamic family law of 1984, Islamic law is defined as, it could be according to the Shafi'i mazhab, Maliki mazhab, Hanbali mazhab, Hanafi, or even Zaidi, which is the Shia teaching. That was in the law books. And then when the reforms took place, instead of progressing, we regressed, and all those references to other mazhab were removed, and only the Shafi'i mazhab is used. But we know that the Islamic family law in Malaysia, for example, the grounds for divorce, those are not Shafi'i grounds, because Shafi'i has limited grounds for divorce. Those grounds for divorce come from Maliki school of law. So we've had a tradition of using the best fiqh arguments and reasons from all schools of law because of the belief that there must be justice. Yeah, so there was that trajectory in one period of our lawmaking process when there was a belief in the trajectory of reform towards equality and justice for women. That belief and that philosophy and that political will to bring about justice for women is gone. So we're facing this now. This is the challenge now. That's why for us, in Sisters in Islam, in MUSAWAH, really, we cannot depend on the government, on the religious authorities to bring about the change we want to see. It's how do we, as citizens, create, a vision of Islam that upholds equality and justice, and provide the alternative arguments, and to build a culture of public debate, and to build public support for the kind of Islam that we believe in.
I'd like to add to what Zainah has shared with us just now. This difference between Indonesia and Malaysia, I think this is something very, very important for us to try to understand. It has, I think, a lot to do with the nationalist movement in Indonesia and the nature of that struggle compared to Malaysia. That has to be the backdrop in any discussion, in any attempt to compare the two countries. In Indonesia, broadly speaking, the nationalist movement was led by an intelligentsia that was not really linked to the traditional centers of power in Indonesian society. It was a new intelligentsia that emerged, partly because of the nature of Dutch rule. In the case of Malaya, British rule was very different in the sense that they ruled through the traditional elites. They used the traditional elites, and they adopted an approach to Malay society and Islam that mirrored the interests of the traditional elite. In the case of Indonesia, the Dutch, as you know, their rule was much more penetrative compared to British rule in Malaya, and they did not go through the traditional elites at all in terms of their administration of Islam. In fact, they administrated Islam. They were involved in the administration of Islam. And that created a reaction from new groups that emerged in the Indonesian struggle for independence, who were against the way the Dutch were using Islam, and who were against the traditional elites. Some of those were still colluding with the Dutch. So it produced a different way of looking at Islam, and that I think was a very, very important factor. And that became the rationalization of the Indonesian struggle for independence. It was, for want of a better term, a middle class, an emerging middle class, people like Sukarno, Hatta, and the others. They were not from the traditional elites. And they found strength in a more progressive, a more inclusive, more dynamic interpretation of Islam. Even if you look at some of our religious reformers, some of those who were known as part of the Kaum Tua, who were better than the Kaum, the religious interpreters here were known as the Kaum Muda, who were better than the Kaum Tua. But even the Kaum Muda, if you look at some of their concerns, so different actually from Indonesia, because there they were dealing with some of these challenges that Islam has had to deal with in a post-independent society, challenges of modernity, of national reconstruction, and so on. So their thinking was shaped by that, which is why, in addition to what Zainah had said about gender studies, and I think there's a very good point that Zainah made about the way they've incorporated gender studies in various universities and so on. You just go to Indonesian pesantren's. This is something that really struck me when I visited some of these pesantren's, that they were so different from our madrasas. They were studying Ibn Rushd. They were studying Ibn Sina, which you will never see in this country. Ibn Khaldun, even Ibn Khaldun is not used in our madrasas. So you can see the sort of situation that exists here. I think this is a very important point. The education, a product of the social milieu, and the changes that have taken place. Yeah?
I could just
please, Clive.
just add briefly to what both Chandra and Zainah said. Certainly, Chandra, yes. In Indonesia, unlike in Malaysia, there was a deep, broad-based movement of national emancipation. And Islam, as a culture, as a political culture, was part of that national emancipatory movement in a very profound way. And Islam itself, the spirit of emancipation and of self-emancipation, of creating individual and collective liberty, became part of the, I don't like to use the expression DNA, I don't like biologizing anything that's not biological, but it became part of the inbuilt traditions of modern Indonesian Islam, which is radically different from what happened in this country, whereas Chandra says it was all top-down, elite management, social control, buttressing and shoring up traditional, an attenuated form of traditional authority that had already been hamstrung by the British, but was then licensed by the British to protect itself in this simulacrum of tradition kind of way, in this invented traditional way. Going back to then what Zai says about the nature of the curriculum and so on, look, it goes back, if liberty is or is to be made or is to be made in a very living sense, an Islamic value, a value in Islam, the question is not, it's a matter of interpretation, the question is not, what does the sacred text say? We all know pretty clearly, in the case of most traditions, what the sacred texts say. We know pretty well much what the range of accepted, the leeway for interpretation and fiddling around and stretching from within those traditional views of sacred texts are. The question is not what the sacred texts say. The fundamental question is, how are modern people to live with their sacred texts and traditions? What are they to make of them? How are they to do this? Who are the groups who are going to do this? What are going to be the intellectual and political and human and ethical forces that drive the process of interpretation? That is the key question. And so you can have as many faculties of traditional Islamic studies or Buddhist studies or Talmudic studies, whatever, they can go and tell you endlessly what the strict constructionist view of the sacred text is. That is not what the current agenda is about in that sense. The question is not what the texts say, but how do modern people live with and engage with those texts as people of this time, this place, in this complex, pluralistic world that has already been, in some sense, broken, but has also had the windows of emancipation opened within it by modernity and by those emancipatory forces in world history.
Thank you to all speakers for the response. In fact, I would like to add, I was just back from Jakarta for a conference on Islamic education earlier this week, which most of the participants are also academic and also education practitioners. What I would notice clearly is that when they talk about Islam, and also when they explain about what is being taught in Islamic universities, because the conference was organized by the University Islam Negeri Jakarta, there are clear integrations in their courses between the Islamic studies and the social sciences, meaning that even though they are students of Islamic education studies, they also learn about the social science, the methods, the phenomenologies, and how to understand human societies, which at the end, the findings of their study can tend to be very multidisciplinary and also very practical, instead of, I don't know, because I haven't been in Malaysian University Islamic faculty for quite a number of years. Just maybe some here can also share opinions. How far have we developed if we want to compare to those?
Thank you. I think I have 3 or 4. I don't know whether they're comments or questions. There might be comments, but the panelists may want to respond. The first one, Professor Hashemi, is really a question of semantics. I'm Dr. Narima from G25. You pointed at the beginning that freedom and liberty can be used synonymously, but you said there is a slight difference in its meaning. And here I'm wearing my G25 hat again. It is semantics that yesterday I raised a question about secularism and how G25 has been demonized for that. So we in G25, we are really suffering from this. The extremists, including the religious authorities, they call us liberal, what they call us, liberalist. And I can, you know, I'm not very good in English. So liberty and liberalism, what's the connection really? And it's very interesting. They would never use the word kebebasan to describe us as bebas. Maybe the word bebas is not so negative. So they always use the English word liberalisme. So dia mengatakan orang G25-nya semuanya penganut liberalisme, which is decadent, which is immoral. So it is really a question of semantics that we are suffering from. My second thing is, Dr. Hashemi, you mentioned about, I'm very interested in Shabir Akhtar's book and the 2 challenges of humanistic secularism and ideological pluralism. And you mentioned that these are challenges for Muslims today. When I listen to you, to me as a Muslim, as an individual, I don't find any controversy there. I'm not confused. I can say that as far as humanistic secularism said, my answer to your question is yes, one can be an atheist, one may not believe, but one can still be a good, moral, outstanding, righteous person. And about ideological pluralism, I think we just have to accept that what you said, that the arguments of the past era is no more valid today, and we have to adapt ourselves. However, the challenge I think for us is, how do people like me, people like Zainah, who believe in this and we have strong opinions on this, how can we be daring enough to pose our opinions on the powers that be and not get labeled as whatever or put under the Sedition Act? And in context of this, one of the things I learned when Professor Abdullah Naim was here last year, he said 3 times, I remember I counted 3 times, he said this in the seminar as well as at the press conference at which I was present. He said, I can only be a true believer if I am given the freedom to not believe. So he feels that in a country that doesn't allow atheism, that being an atheist is a crime, he said it's not a good thing because you are forced to be a Muslim. It's not a very meaningful Muslim. Whereas if I'm allowed to unbelieve and yet I choose to believe, then I'm a better Muslim. I hope I'm not taking too much time. My third thing is, I saw 2 different approaches. Prof. Chandra Muzaffar, I don't mean to be critical here, but I was a little despondent when you said that, well, people in the past, societies in the past have been faced with bigger challenges than what we are facing today. So let's, like, maybe you didn't say this word. So I find you are very non-confrontational. I was so scared you might be very accepting of the political, religious corruption that we have today because I cannot accept it. And I don't think I want to take the passive way. And you said that we worship, at least our leaders worship religion instead of worshiping God. And Prof. Kessler followed that up by saying that Prof. Chandra Muzaffar put this question as to how, but I'm very disappointed that we go away from this seminar this afternoon by nobody telling us how, what is the how to do this? How do we change, these bigoted leaders and corrupted leaders that we have? So we have no answer to that. Finally, I'm sorry. You know, Dr. Hashemi, I found it very interesting when you answered the question about, your question, what was the relationship between liberty and Islam in past eras as it is being understood today? And you mentioned in the past era there was more communal interest, whereas today people are very individualistic. I'm part of G25, but I'm a public health specialist. So in public health, there's a very, very important principle, the interest of the community and the interest of the freedom of the individual. The freedom of the individual may have to be sacrificed for the interest of the bigger community. We have practically controlled all childhood diseases that are vaccine preventable. We don't have diphtheria, we don't have whooping cough, we certainly don't have polio. Last year we had 22 cases of diphtheria, 6 of them died. And why? Because the family said, well, it's my personal freedom not to vaccinate my child. I don't want to vaccinate my child because I fear the vaccine is haram. But by them not vaccinating the child, they are making other children susceptible to the disease because it's an infectious disease. So in that case, freedom of the individual has to be sacrificed for the common good.
My name is Ali Salman, and I'm CEO of an organization called Istanbul Network for Liberty, which is actually registered in Malaysia. This organization is a global platform for researchers working on Islam and liberty issues in 3 spheres of economic liberty, political liberty, and religious freedom. I would like to relate my remarks with the last response by Professor Kessler, and maybe pose a question to Dr. Nader Hashemi here. Professor Kessler mentioned very eloquently that it's perhaps the debate or the challenge is not that that is not more of a theological nature, because the scripts and the interpretation of scripts can be done in either way. The question is more that how do we live and how do we argue freedom and liberty in our modern context. And the question, Professor Hashemi, is that in your analysis, and if you look at the level of discourse at the intellectual level, let's say the discourse on Islam and public life, Islam and political freedom or economic freedom, where do you see that the question of liberty is somehow being seriously addressed at scholarly level, at academic level, or it's still at more level of general debate? Do you think that the scholars are there who are finding answers to these difficult questions being posed today, or not really? Thank you.
I'm Mahalil. Just a few days ago, Pope Francis made a remark that you cannot argue with the devil. The devil, you cannot win if you argue with the devil. So, and he said the devil is a person, just a few days ago. So I like Professor Nader to comment on Pope Francis' view on this. And secondly, when you mentioned the creation of human being, what I know is that when God created angel, the angel is being created perfectly obedient and totally loyal to God, undisputable about this. But how come Iblis can be so disloyal to God? And do God know that Iblis is going to do this? So that is the question now. It puzzles me. Number 3, a postgraduate student asked me a question. I cannot give a comfortable answer to his question. The question is that after the day of judgment, some of us will go to heaven, some of us will go to hell. And is that the end of human destiny? What are you going to do after that? Are those people who go to heaven, they're having disco all the time? And those stay in the hell will suffer forever? Is that the end of human destiny? Of course, I cannot give a comfortable answer to the student. I hope you can assist me. Thank you.
Okay, I'll be as quickly and as efficient as possible. With respect to your comment and sort of question, you raised it today and you raised it yesterday, that some religious authorities call the G25 liberal or as a way of condemning you and targeting you. My advice to you is to not get locked in a debate and exchange as to whether you're liberal or not, and as to whether your accusers are extremists. That debate is fundamentally unproductive and it gets you nowhere. I would recommend that you actually try and shift the conversation away from labels and focusing instead on values. What values do we as Malaysians hold dear that should be the foundation for the creation of a just society? Do we believe that all Malaysians have the right to participate in public decision making? Do we believe as Malaysians we believe in a free press? That we believe in accountable government? That we believe in free and fair elections? Those are the things that I think you should be focusing on rather than trying to defend yourself as a liberal or accusing them of being extremist or fundamentalist. Because I think that's a much more productive way of responding to those types of accusations. With respect to the question that was asked about the possibility of reconciling Islam and liberty, is this happening at the scholarly level? Is it happening at the more local level? At the scholarly level, I can off the top of my head name at least 10 prominent distinguished scholars of Islam who have provided extremely enlightened, Islamically authentic interpretations of Islam that make it completely compatible with notions of liberty. The problem that we're facing today is that those intellectuals and their scholarship and their ideas and their teachings really are accessible to a very small number of Muslims. The vast majority of Muslims at the local level, at the grassroots level, do not read the scholarship of Abdullahi al-Naim or Khalid Abu Fadl, or they've never heard of Fazlur Rahman. And I think this is one of the challenges of Islamic reform, is to try and make the ideas of people who have come up with very Islamically authentic but emancipatory or enlightened or human rights centered or democratic interpretations of Islam more popular to the masses. This is something that can't take place overnight. It fundamentally has to do with questions of Islamic education, with the training of our imams. Unfortunately, most of our imams around the world are trained in places like Al-Azhar or in Saudi Arabia, where the interpretation of Islam that they learn and then they come back and they teach to the masses is extremely retrograde and reactionary, and this is a problem that has to be changed. So there's no shortage of ideas. The challenge is, how do you disseminate Islamically authentic, emancipatory, and ideas that are compatible with human rights and democracy to the mass level? There's an interesting story that I think is very illuminating here, is Pakistan has produced a number of important intellectuals and Islamic scholars. One of them, who I'm talking about tonight, is Fazlur Rahman. Fazlur Rahman was one of the great Islamic intellectuals of the 20th century. If you ask the average Muslim in Pakistan today, have you ever heard of Fazlur Rahman? You get the answer, no. If you ask the average Pakistani Muslim, have you heard the name Maulana Maududi? Everyone will say yes. And you know what the difference is? Maulana Maududi had an organization. He had a grassroots ground game. His ideas were disseminated by a whole group of his followers, and his ideas sunk deep roots. Fazlur Rahman was an intellectual who, because he was persecuted, fled Pakistan and ended up at the University of Chicago, where he died, and he influenced a number of students and scholars. But the ideas, so the point here is that if you want ideas to really change society, you have to have movements, social movements that have grassroots connections that can then speak to people on the local level. One of the problems with intellectuals is they tend to be very comfortable in speaking to fellow intellectuals, but they don't get involved in what really needs to get done, and that's, how do you influence the masses? how do you sort of speak at the local level in a language, in an idiom, where someone who doesn't have a PhD from Harvard and is just a simple Muslim trying to make sense of their life, how can you engage with them? That requires, a lot of hard work and a lot of thinking, and unless that happens, I don't see any possibility of sort of change happening anytime soon. The question that was also posed to me about the Pope, I'm not really sure I understand your question. So maybe afterwards you can come up to me after this event is over and we can talk one-on-one, and I'll try my best to sort of answer the questions that you posed about what the Pope said and about what will happen to human existence after we pass from this earth, what humans will be doing in heaven and hell. I mean, I don't have any, I'm not really sure what your question is, but if you speak to me afterwards, I'll try my best to give you an intelligent answer.
I'll respond mainly to Dr. Narima's comment here. But before that, could I add a little bit to what Nader had just said in relation to Pakistan, Fazlur Rahman and Maududi? Yeah. I think it would be more appropriate, Nader, to compare Maududi to Iqbal and not to Fazlur Rahman. Mm-hmm. Why? Because Maududi was a contemporary of Iqbal. Right. Fazlur Rahman was 2-3 decades later. Mm-hmm. And this comparison, I think, is very interesting between Maududi and Iqbal. Mm-hmm. The reason why Maududi appealed to the masses was partly because he spoke a language, meaning by which the content of what you were saying, that corresponded with how a lot of Pakistanis felt about Islam. It was Islam under siege, that sort of language, that we have to restore the greatness of Islam and all the rest of it. Now, Iqbal also said some similar things about the situation facing Muslims and all the rest of it. But Iqbal, if you ask the same question, Nadir, to Pakistanis, everyone would have heard of Iqbal. But what's the reason? It's because I think Iqbal first addressed the question of nationalism and freedom, which was very, very important to the masses at that time. And the whole question of freedom, nationalism, and so on was very vital to them. Now, if a scholar in Pakistan today talks about liberty, about justice, about gender rights, and so on, it doesn't have that sort of resonance, that sort of traction as far as the masses are concerned. That makes a very big difference. Yeah? And Iqbal is known because of his poetry. Right. I think that was very, very important. Poetry had a mass appeal. Right. And since he was such an accomplished poet, and he was a poet of the nationalist movement, of independence and so on, that had, I think, a very big impact. Yeah? Now, of course, the fate of Fazlur Rahman is a great tragedy, one of the great tragedies, what happened to him. But I think this comparison between Maududi and Iqbal will be very interesting. If I may just add a little bit to that, here in Malaysia, it is amazing, because there's so little appreciation of ideas in this country, even amongst those who are part of the intelligentsia, that you had an individual, a politician in this country, who paid obeisance to both Maududi and Iqbal at the same time. He was a great supporter of Iqbal, he was also a great supporter of Maududi, and he got away with it. Because I think here people don't appreciate this. There's a very big difference between Maududi and Iqbal. The Pakistanis some of my Pakistani friends were shocked that, one could be both a devotee of Maududi and Iqbal in Malaysia. But I said only in Malaysia. Things like that, happen, because there isn't that sort of intellectual sophistication. Now, going back to Dr. Narima's comments about, the thing about semantics and about the way certain terms are used here, I would say this very quickly, that the reason why I think there's this attack against liberalism in this country, liberalism, the word liberal, for some reason that is inexplicable, a lot of these guys, ulama and non-ulama, they link the term liberal with LGBT. This is part of it. Sorry? Link it with the LGBT movement, that liberal means LGBT, which is really ridiculous, because they forget that there is a whole intellectual tradition connected with that term. And for many of us, I speak, for myself on this matter, I agree with many things that are part of the liberal tradition, but I also disagree with various things in the liberal tradition, just as, you know, the other great Western intellectual trend is Marxism, yeah, in relation to 19th century Europe. There are things I agree with Marxism, there are things that I disagree with Marxism. But to equate liberalism and liberal with LGBT here in Malaysia, and then you sort of, this is a straw man thing, you know, you create this thing and you start attacking it and all the rest of it without a proper basis, no intellectual basis for this sort of, you know, attack. I know it's happening in other societies, but in Malaysia, I see this quite often, equating it with the LGBT movement. I think one has to try to clarify that, as some of us have tried to do on various occasions. And it is a problem which has begun to haunt us for the last 20 years or so. In the past, it was not like that, and which is why the framers of the Rukun Negara, they used the term liberal without any difficulty, because they had a different understanding of the, you know, term. Liberal for them was being open, accepting, sorry?
Not a dirty word.
Not a dirty word, you know, but now this becomes something else that I think is part of the, you know, problem. Atheism, you know, Dr. Narima, is not a crime in Malaysia. It's not a crime in Malaysia. Meaning by which, you know, no one can go up to someone and say, you know, you profess atheism, I'm going to put you in jail. Yeah, it hasn't reached that stage yet. I don't know whether it will, but here again, this is where public discourse on certain issues is important. When you have a deputy minister saying that, you know, if you're an atheist, it is a crime, people should respond and tell him that he's wrong. The Constitution doesn't say that an atheist doesn't have rights or things of that sort. We may have our own views about atheism, but that's something else, right? So I don't think we should describe it as a crime. It's not. But the other point you made about that one didn't take on the corrupt and the bigoted and so on, I think that's a terrible injustice. To say that people like us, we haven't taken on these elements. Of course we have. We may not have done it the way you have done it, or some others have done it, but we have been doing it all the while. I've written 14 articles on 1MDB, right? And we have had to pay the price. We don't go around broadcasting, you know, about this, you know. Yes, and Malaysia has suffered as a result of the positions that I've taken. Just as suffered as a result of the positions that we've taken. And in the past, I've had a lot of problems with the establishment at various times, yeah. Some people who are anti-establishment today, but they were part of that establishment that I had problems with at one time. So this has been going on. So I don't think one should see it that way. You know? Perhaps one has a different way of dealing with some of these issues. But I write about them, I analyze them, I talk about them, but I don't respond to everything that happens on a daily basis. But it is the larger trends and the larger implications of what's happening. That's what should concern us. I'm very worried about the rise of bigotry in certain circles, but I don't see that as the biggest problem in our country. I don't see that as the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem in our country, I've said this umpteen times, it is the decline of integrity in public life. That is the biggest problem. And I think it is sad that those who are concerned about it, in addressing this challenge, they've really messed up certain things. I'm talking about segments of the opposition in this country. If they'd approached this challenge in a different manner, I think we could have at least tried to build up a movement around principles of integrity. But instead, the moment they sort of became very partisan in addressing this issue, and some of their own personal partisan interests got entangled with this larger question of integrity, because what had happened in this country the last couple of years, it is a major question of integrity. Can you imagine one of the worst, most despicable cases that you can think of money laundering had happened, and the public, the intelligentsia, we're not just talking of the masses, the intelligentsia was prepared to go along with it. And you had a ruling party and others related to the ruling party were prepared to support the leadership. And this, I think, is really a shame. It's a disgrace. But how do you address this? But the moment you become partisan, you destroy your own credibility. And this is what has happened. And I think what is equally sad is that there are many NGOs in this country who have also chosen to become partisan. And as a result, they've weakened the struggle against integrity. I'm glad in that sense that G25, and I'm judging you entirely on the basis of statements that you all have made, G25, I think, has remained non-partisan. That I think is very, very important. Groups have to remain non-partisan in this sort of situation, not get sucked into party politics, because then you lose your credibility. I went into party politics. I know what it is. I know what it is. You know, so it is a very big struggle. Remain where you are, address the issues, and we've got big issues here: ethnic relations, problems connected with integrity, problems connected with the gap between rich and poor, and so on. But we don't have movements around these ideas. And you find that Malaysian public life is actually dominated by political parties, which I think is very sad. So this is something that we have to get out of. You know? So if you're fighting for truth and justice on all these major challenges, you know, Dr. Narima, I'm on the same page with you. Thank you.
First of all, on the question of Fazlur Rahman. Not many people here have heard, but some have. I always, in this country, when the name comes up, I recall an occasion at the then newly established IKIM, created, you may recall, by a former Prime Minister who created both IKIM and the Islamic University to be an intellectual forcing house for ideas to counter the traditional, conventional, or what we would now call fundamentalist, extremist kinds of. And in one sense, it's hard to be in opposition in this country. On the other hand, it seems to me this is one of the countries that's been more generous than perhaps any other I can think of towards its opposition. The government here has created great institutions like the International Islamic University and IKIM, and then handed them over wholesale to the other side as instruments in their battle against the very purposes for which those bodies were created. And I cast my mind back to one of the early events at the new IKIM business that near the, what's the Kapong roundabout they call it there, at which the late Qasim Ahmad was being given a second chance to raise his questions about the hadith and how hadith were to be understood historically. And he was up there against three other people, one of whom was Dr. what's his name, Al-Muhammadi Osman. And at one stage I got up there and said, well, may I quote Fazlur Rahman? And Fazlur Rahman said, we have to understand all these things historically is the greatest challenge. And I more or less to put it there to say, Qasim Ahmad is saying nothing different than that. And Dr. Osman al-Muhammadi stood up and said, yes, Fazlur Rahman was a great man in the history, in the intellectual history of 20th century Islam. And he paused, he said, unfortunately, his aqidah was questionable. Now that is, you know, so it's not just ignorance that one's up against something much deeper. And it's got to do with the kind of, the ignorance is there as part of the supporting environment, together with a general indifference to ideas, a refusal to take ideas seriously, so that by default, conventional, rather regressive or unthinking ideas seem to be, they seem to be just part of the furniture, part of like the air and water, part of the natural environment, because there's no basis for a question. And this gets to the question about the current use of, how liberalism has become increasingly a dirty word in this country. I always was struck by the fact that, I always asked my question, would the prejudice against state schooling have been as strong initially in this country and in Indonesia if the word sekolah was not, if people could not suggest that sekolah had something to do with secular? Because for a lot of people in village society, it was a false etymology, but it told a truth that they wanted to believe or people were encouraging them to believe. Similarly, in Indonesia, not in this country, the lingua franca of the Dutch ruling elite in Indonesia was French. And of course, they referred to newspapers as courant, current affair, current news. And suddenly they say, you see these people, they want to replace the Quran with their Quran. And it's just one of these unfortunate happenstances about words that it similarly enabled this kind of substitution, this false etymology to say, you see, they wish to put schools schools are there for secularism, and modern language is there is being put on an equal footing with the Quran and being there to replace it. Now, I think something, it's not quite the same, but I suspect that something similar is going on, that the word liberal is being massaged and reinvented in some way in this country. At the moment, I'm not quite sure altogether how it's going, but part of it seems to be that quite clearly a lot of people, for local reasons and for more than local reasons, recognise that they have to be, and also something want to be and need to be, against what they now call extremism. But they have no discursively redeemable, solid intellectual grounds for saying what is extremism, and what it is, why it's bad, and why it is you've got to be against it. And all they can do is invoke some ungrounded notion of moderation and saying, we are the golden middle path between two equally evil things. There's on the one hand extremism, on the other hand there's liberalism. And as I don't want to mention royal personages, but somebody may remember a royal personage said the other day that these were two equally horrendous evils that equally had to be abjured, that had to be avoided. Now, there's something going on that the whole notion of liberalism, and the word liberal is being used to, I don't want to sound like a postmodernist, but it's being used to construct a certain political position by less than intellectually explicit, clear and reputable means. And I'm not blaming the royal family. The people who are driving this, and there are some intellectually, they're not stupid, they're very smart people. The people who are running this line and who are generating these lines for others to use are by and large people such as people in ICSIM and people like Dr. Ashraf Wajdi. These are very, very serious players, and they are not falling into this out of ignorance. They know exactly what they are doing, it seems to me. But then I'm an outsider, I don't really understand these things. You must make great allowance for discount everything I say. These are just prejudices of an ignoramus.
Absolutely agree with what's been said. Just two issues I thought I'll pick up. One, Dr. Narima's point about how to prevent attacks and labelings and all that, and demonization. I think, these attacks are inevitable. It's a waste of time to bellyache and to, like Nader Hashemi said about directly engage in that debate on labels and demonization. That in the training that MUSAWAH does in the 7-day short course, we have 1 day of strategizing. And we tell the participants, look, they recognize the importance of engaging with the religion from a rights perspective. They recognize the importance of creating a public voice and a tradition of public debate, that if there is no debate, if you don't start questioning, that partly is the human rights activists and the women's rights activists and the elites who are at fault for allowing this kind of radical extremist Islam to take root, because they were not challenged. We were so busy with other things that when it comes to Islam, leave it to the religious authorities, leave it to the graduates of the Islamic schools, of the madrasas, and to define what Islam is and what it's not. And we are rather late in coming into the picture to engage in producing a different understanding of Islam and to engage in this public debate that is so necessary for change to take place. So if you're we're entering territory that others feel is their territory. What right, what authority do you have to speak on Islam when you're not covered up, you don't have Arabic, you haven't studied 20 years, in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or wherever. But what, and so it is necessary to build knowledge. We tell the participants, knowledge is extremely important. It is only with knowledge that you will have the courage to stand your ground when you're attacked. You will be attacked, so that you should accept that as par for the cause. In engaging with this struggle, attacks are par for the cause, and there's no need to waste time to bellyache over that. But what we need to do is really, to open up that debate. So, for example, when Sisters in Islam, I mean, it's a strategy that we use. When the fatwa, when the book banning came, when the fatwa came, we decided to go to court and challenge, because it is important. Whether we win or lose is not the most important thing. The important thing to show to the religious authorities that they do not have the monopoly on religion and what Islam is and what it's not. In a country, in a democratic country where Islam is used as a source of law and public policy, everyone has a right to engage in that debate and defining what Islam means to you and how it is used as a source of law and public policy. It cannot be the sole preserve. I tell them, when they question, what authority do you have to speak on Islam? I say, well, if you don't want me, people like me, to speak out on Islam and how it's understood and how it's used and abused, then you take Islam out of the public sphere. Then it doesn't matter. You can produce 1,000 pages of scholarship. It doesn't matter. It remains in the realm of ideas and private faith, whether you want to believe or you don't believe. But when you want to use the whole coercive power of a modern state to impose one single understanding of Islam on everybody, and those who disagree will be charged, will be arrested, will be questioned, fatwa made, books banned, and all these things, then everyone has a right to question, to challenge, to think, to decide what kind of Islam do we want in the public space. So I think it's important to just focus what is the struggle and to really engage in that, what Nader said about focusing on the values. What kind of a nation state? What kind of Islam? What kind of Islamic law? What's the purpose of it? That larger issues. And the other thing is the whole, what Nader was raised about dissemination of ideas. Why is it that, the conservative, extremist, intolerant ideas take root, and the ideas that we are espousing on equality, on justice, on liberal values, it's so hard to take root. And this is a challenge that all of us, face, in trying to get these ideas out there in the public space. This is why it's so important, for activists, for groups like G25, for IRF, to hold more and more of this, to disseminate the ideas, and to do it in, people don't read. MUSAWAH produces books, and we know people don't read. So we come out with this very little 4-page, short nuggets to get people to read. And not only we're doing this, it takes about 7 minutes maybe to read this. We're even now producing videos 3 minutes. You don't want to read this, watch the video that's 3 minutes long. What's the Islam and the question of gender equality. What's the difference between Sharia fiqh and state laws? Because everybody conflates Sharia fiqh, state laws, everything is the same. All Sharia is divine law and it cannot be changed. It's not. So how do we get the public, especially in today's context, to understand that there is this incredibly rich tradition, in the Islamic legal history. There are incredibly modern, sophisticated concepts of public interest, of diversity of opinions, of choosing the best opinion among different opinions to serve the public. These are very sophisticated concepts that we should be proud of, that we should use today to bring about the kind of change. But our religious authorities, in wanting to maintain their sole power and authority, are not interested in using these rich concepts and legal tools that exist to bring about change, because they're not interested in change. So I think we should not be scared. What we need to do is to read about the incredible, Nader said, there's no shortage of ideas. The ideas are all there. But we need to read, we need to absorb, and then we need to open up the space, for public discussion on these issues. Change is not going to happen, within 4 walls. Change is going to happen when we make it politically costly for our political masters to continue in the ways they have been, abusing the religion, to continue their rule and their privileged status in this world. So just stand up, speak out, read, please, because without knowledge, you will not have the courage to stand your ground, because you're gonna be attacked, and it is only knowledge that's going to give you the courage to stand your ground when you are attacked.
I fully agree with Professor Chandra that when the situation is so bad and so challenging as we are today in this country, integrity is the biggest challenge, and religion is being used by politics and religious authorities for power. It's important that civil society organizations like G25 must not be tempted to take sides, to be politicized. So it is very tempting, of course, when the situation is bad, to take sides. But we must not, I think G25 and many of our friends in the civil society organization, if we want to bring about change, we want to turn around things, we need to be above politics. We should not be caught up in the dirty politics of today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rizwan. Thank you, Professor Nader Hashemi, Zainah, Anwar, Dr. Chandra, Muzaffar, Clive, Kessler. We'd like to call for another round of applause. We had a fantastic discussion today. Okay. So before we finish, I just pass back the session to the chairperson today, Julia. Thank you very much.
All this discussion after the roundtable we had today made me recall two very important questions from Russian popular philosophical tradition. These questions are, who is guilty and what to do? These questions have been with us since 19th century, and they were posed respectively by prominent public thinkers, Ehsan and Chernyshevsky, but this is not what is important now. So I'm very sorry that we have to adjourn this discussion exactly at the moment that right at the end of it we started to approach to answering these questions, maybe not so much about who is guilty, but definitely about what to do or what can be done. But there are several things which give us some optimism. First and foremost, we finally can leave this place which is being maintained badly cold for no reason. Second, and actually, if to speak seriously, the most important is the intellectual energy and power that our speakers shared with us today and created this very special space for us to have this discussion about burning issues. And the third reason for optimism is that I would like to extend the invitation to all of you to join two other sessions that the Islamic Renaissance Front is going to have with Dr. Nader Hashemi. It is the reading session today, starting at 8 o'clock on neo-modernist Islam, Fazlur Rahman and the rethinking of Islamic tradition. So those of you who are very interested in continuing the conversation about Fazlur Rahman, we are inviting you to join tonight at Sri Hartamas. And the second one remaining with Dr. Nader Hashemi will be a roundtable discussion tomorrow at the University of Nottingham at 2 o'clock. Is there a link between religiosity and authoritarianism? So please feel free and welcome to join. And we thank you all and invite you to join us for the tea and lunch. Thank you.